Well, I was born in Melbourne and brought up in a southeastern suburb called Ashburton. And my parents moved there in 1939, just before the war, and I was born just after the war, so I'm a baby boomer. And I went to primary school at the local school and then to secondary school at Carey Grammar School. From whence, when I matriculated, I applied to join the military college, and then I went to Duntroon. My father had served during the war, and my uncles as well, but we grew up with the war in our background. We were so close. And as I was reaching the end of secondary school, I looked at going to university, and I could have gone to university, but the course on offer was an arts degree. And I thought, oh, if I get an arts degree, I'll end up being a teacher, and that didn't really appeal. So I went up to the local shops, and there was a recruiting element there, and I picked up a brochure for Duntroon, and they said you can get a degree. And I was actually quite attracted to that and the physical aspect of being in the army, because I was actually quite a good sportsman at school. I finished high school in 1963. The school I went to had no cadets, so I'd not been a cadet at school, unlike very many of my classmates at Duntroon. So it was learning it all from the start. And obviously leaving home, we were all 17, or I was just about 18, so quite an early age to leave home. And the transition was sort of hard. There was all sorts of stories about bastardisation at Duntroon. And yes, you did get a little bit of that hazing sort of stuff. In my case, not too much. And the company I was in, the staff cadets were broken into 4 companies. The company I was in was quite relaxed, and apart from 1 or 2 individuals. So it was a difficult transition, I suppose, but it was, in a sense, wasn't too hard. The companies were all led. There were 4 years of students at Duntroon, or 4 years of cadets. So the cadets in their last year filled the leadership appointments in each company, and the companies were in a battalion, so the battalion sergeant major, the BSM, was a cadet as well. We were supposed to be the first course to go through that would get a university degree in our time there. The classes ahead of us did academic studies, but there was no promise to them of a degree. And so we worked our way through, and the college was teaming up with the University of New South Wales. And we got to the final year, and they said, oh, we haven't quite got it fixed up yet. So we all graduated with diplomas of military studies. And I still believe the promise was that we would get this degree in retrospect, but as it turned out, we didn't. And many of us, some were sent on to university from Duntroon. Many of us went back on our own initiative, took whatever credits, whatever university we went to would give us. Some of the fellows who graduated in our first year there had been deployed to Vietnam by then, so we actually knew them personally. For most of us, I think the war was a continuation of the Army's commitment to regional conflicts that had been going on before we even joined. So in a sense, it didn't seem unusual. And certainly in the arts course where I was, in our last year, the history we did was all concerned with the Vietnam War. So it was Bob O'Neill who was our history instructor, and we went through the French side of the conflict and the beginnings of our involvement. In your final year, you put in a preference, and depending on what the Army needed and what the staff thought of your capabilities, I guess, you either got your preference or you didn't. And I think most most of the Duntroon fellows would have got their preference because in those days there was Duntroon and Portsea and Skyville, 3 officer-producing establishments, not to mention the RAC school for the women. But I think, I don't know this is true, but I suspect the Army would have said, okay, we will give the Duntroon graduates their preference, and anything down the line would be filled up by the other 2 places. 3 years of camp training at Duntroon as an infantryman, carrying a machine gun or the machine gun spare parts bag and tromping through the bush, so it was a tough decision really. I knew I wanted to go to one of the combat arms, didn't want to go to one of the service corps. Intelligence I thought might be worthwhile, but in the end I said no, I'll go to a combat arm, and so I chose artillery to go to. And in the final years, the camp training in the final year, when the corps out on exercises as an infantry battalion, the artillery graduates are all filling forward observer roles or something like that, but you didn't have any specific training for it. And so for everybody except infantry, I think, the first 3 months of your commissioned service was actually doing a course in your particular arm or service to change you from being an infantry platoon commander, which is what Duntroon turned out, into being, in our case, a section commander in an artillery battery. Whilst we were on the young officers course, the artillery staffs came down and said, okay, we've got these regiments and these vacancies in each regiment, put in your preference. So most of us chose to go to the regiment that was training in that year, so now 1968, training to go to Vietnam in 1969. It's very rare for someone to finish the young officers course and go straight to Vietnam. I don't think I ever know it happened. But so I was lucky enough to get posted to 1st Field Regiment, which was the one to go in 69. And so we marched in there in April, and there was about 5 or 6 of us off the course who went, and they broke us up and allotted us to a battery. So I was allotted to the 105th Field Battery as a section commander. When I marched in, we filled the junior positions in the battery. The battery commander was already there, the battery captain. The senior lieutenant on the gun line was called a gun position officer. And in the battery I went to, that was filled by a chap who'd come on to full-time service from the Army Reserve. So he'd actually worked his way up from a gunner to a gun sergeant, and then transferred into the command post and worked his way up, and then done officer training in the reserve and come on full-time service. So I was one of the 2. The battery is broken up into 2 sections, each of 3 guns. I was one of the section commanders. A couple of the other fellows who came were made forward observers, and then they had to go back to the School of Artillery later in the year and do a course to train them to be forward observers. Yeah, and in the battery, the 105th Field Battery had been to Vietnam already. It went over with 1 OER that's the very first artillery battery to go. So it was the first one to be facing going back again. We had a lot of national servicemen, probably 60% of the battery were national servicemen by the time we arrived and by the time we were training again. Yeah, so the biggest group when we arrived were the 9th intake national servicemen. I recall that because for them to go to Vietnam they had to do 6 months. And if they came over with us, we were going in February, they were due to finish their national service obligation in June. So they wouldn't have done 6 months in country. So the question was, what was going to happen? And the answer was they all got sent up early as reinforcements for the battery that preceded us. So they did 2 months before we arrived and then came back and joined us. We'd been given the basics, and so our time over before we went away was every day we would go down and practice, and we had to do command post drills, that is turning a grid reference into a bearing and elevation to be ordered to the guns. And so you had to understand fire orders that were coming into you. You had to convert that into data and work with we had two surveyors. What was their trade? They were called surveyors. But they were operating instruments which converted grid references into bearings, and then we had to add on all sorts of effective meteorology, the difference in height between the gun and the target. We didn't fire far enough to worry about the rotation of the Earth during the time of flight, but there are all sorts of little things you had to add in order to make that bearing and elevation accurate. And it took quite some time for us to do that. And the lesson I learnt there, I learnt it from the fellow who was the gun position officer. He was a stickler for doing things by the book. And there are shortcuts you can take, but he wouldn't take shortcuts, and he wouldn't allow us to take shortcuts. And in the end, that degree of rigorous training stood us in very good stead once we got there, because we could function 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, accurately. And that was our big pressure in Vietnam on the gun line. Wasn't the fact that the Viet Cong were outside the wire. Our big pressure was every time we got a grid reference, turning it into an accurate bearing and elevation, so that when the round landed, it landed where it was meant to land. Once we finished the young officers course, we knew we were going to First Field Regiment, so unless something went horribly awry, we knew we were going, and we knew the date we were going, which was the 4th of February 1969. So a couple of guys got sent up early because there'd be a casualty amongst the FO parties or something. So 2 of our FOs got sent up early, but for most of us, we knew which date we were going on. We had pre-embarkation leave in the December, January, and went back to the regiment probably mid-January. And the rest of the time we didn't do any technical training in that time. It was filled up with getting injections and filling out all the forms you had to make sure they had, and making sure you were dentally fit and medically fit. An advance party went a week before the main body. So the battery commander, battery captain, battery sergeant major, gun position officer, and a couple of soldiers left a week before the rest of us. And as I said, a couple of our forward observers were already up there. Some of our gunners were already up there. So the rest of us were left behind. And I was left in charge of the body to bring those fellas up. We had a Qantas 707. Came into Brisbane Airport, already had some of the SAS on board because a classmate of mine was on the same flight as I was. And we flew to Darwin, and then we flew to Singapore. In Singapore, we had to get on the plane, we had to take a white civilian shirt. Before we landed in Singapore, we all had to take off our army shirt, put on a white civilian shirt. And so when we all disembarked, I think it was a bit of theatre, so someone could say this is not a military flight. But there were all these young people with khaki trousers and white shirts. It must have looked funny. Straight into Ton Sanut Airport in Saigon. You come in over the countryside and you can't see a lot of devastation, I guess, but you can see areas where there's craters and all sorts of things. And then you get to Ton Sanut Airport, which is a very busy airport, busy with military aircraft and revetted bays for the aircraft all around, and so the first impression, I guess, is one of excitement, probably mixed with a bit of trepidation. How's it all going to go? From there, they put us on I don't think it was a Hercules. I think it was a smaller version of a Hercules or something, and they flew us out to Nui Dat, and we landed on the Luscombe field at Nui Dat. And then the battery position we were in was actually in the middle of Nui Dat. It wasn't out on the other batteries. Two batteries had positions on the perimeter, but we were the one in the middle. Took over what was already there. And that's what the advance party had been doing for the time they were there, making sure that everything was okay, making sure that each gun has a bit of paperwork associated with it, because every time you fire a round, the barrel wears a bit, and after, lots of rounds and the barrel's worn out, so you have to make sure that all that paperwork's there, that the barrels are still usable. Those sorts of things have to be taken into account. We all lived in tents. The tents were underneath the tent. There was a sandbag wall that been built around underneath the tent, just in case the base was rocketed or mortared or something like that, I guess. We weren't in much danger of small arms fire or anything like that. And we had a decent bed. We had a sort of a bed with a wire frame and a mattress. We didn't have stretchers. The officers lived in a sort of little space of their own. Each section then had a group of tents, with the detachments living in one or two tents. So there's 10-man detachment, so there are probably 2 tents per detachment. And the officers' sergeants had a combined mess. The gunners had a mess, and there was a central kitchen for both of those. And the only other building, I think, they were all in buildings. The only other building, I think, was the battery headquarters cum Q store for the battery. The guns were all, they weren't actually dug in, but they might as well have been, because they all had what we called buns pushed up around them. And because this was a permanent place, that had gone to a fair degree of sophistication. So the inside of the buns had all been revetted with galvanised iron, and the outside had all been sandbagged. And the guns sat in the middle of this on a platform of pierced aluminium planks. So that enabled us, if we had to turn it through 360 degrees, you could just pick up the trails and rotate it easily without the wheels getting bogged or anything like that. And into the bund was built an ammunition shelter which contained the ready use ammunition, and a separate ammunition bunker held the next line of ammunition. I was on 2 rosters basically. I was on a roster to be a section commander, and on a roster to be a duty officer in the command post. And apart from that, if I wasn't on either of those, I was theoretically off duty. So if you were the section commander, your job was to be on the gun line, and when the orders for firing came out, your job was to make sure that those orders had been correctly applied to the guns. And you had to do that without inhibiting the speed of response. So you had a compass, and normally it was okay, because normally one gun would be used to adjust the fire before all the guns fired. So you get behind that particular gun and you take a compass shot down the barrel, which would tell you that the bearing was okay. And then you'd quickly have a look at the sight and see that they'd set the right elevation on it. After that, you could learn, when the bearing changed or the elevation changed, you could actually learn to watch the way they applied it, and you'd know that they were actually applying it correctly. You didn't have to do that every single time. So then by the time the final orders came out, you had to race to the other two guns and make sure they were okay. And on top of that, as a section commander anyway, you were responsible for the administration of your soldiers, and so you'd deal with any of those sorts of issues, make sure, occasionally you'd go around and check on weapons and things like that, make sure the sergeants were getting them to clean their weapons and things properly. So that was one set of duties. Usually we did a morning, an afternoon and a complete night. And so you'd be on, say, section commander in the morning, you might have the afternoon off, and then the whole night you'd be the command post duty officer. And that meant whenever something had to be fired, you were responsible for firing it. They'd negotiate a truce at Christmas time, or they'd negotiate a truce at Easter or Ho Chi Minh's birthday or something like that. And in theory, there'd be a truce. And I think we actually fired through every truce that there was. But apart from that, there wouldn't have been many days where we didn't fire something. It wasn't so much, when you were back in Nui Dat, it wasn't so much you were firing in support of contacts, but you had an extensive harassing and interdiction, H&I program. And that would come down from Task Force headquarters. And throughout the night, basically, you'd be firing at these grid references where they thought that the enemy might be either transiting or camping or whatever. There's 7 propelling charges. The first propelling charge that's noisy, but it's not very noisy. The 7th one, the last one, is very noisy. But it's really weird because after a while you get used to it, and you don't hear it. You hear it, but your brain ignores it. The ones that used to cause the problem in the base were not us. We had a battery of American 155mm howitzers, or occasionally some 8 inches in the base, and when they fired, you had noise plus a blast wave. And if you were in close proximity, it really gave you the willies. I was running to get to the second or third gun that was firing, and I had to approach it sort of at a 45-degree angle front on, and I came over the bun just as the thing fired. And there's the projectile is sent out of the barrel by gas that's caused by the propellant burning behind it. So there's a huge, once it gets to the muzzle, the gas just expands into the air. And so 105s weren't too bad, but there's still a huge, if you're close proximity, there's still a blast wave to worry about. So later on, we were firing a different sort of gun on a different time. It had what was called a muzzle brake on it. So you see some guns have a thing right at the front with some flanges on it. That's a muzzle brake, and that's the gas coming out, hitting those vanes and stopping the gun from recoiling. But it deflects the blast rearwards. And I had my head outside the gun shield when this happened, and I thought I'd ruptured an eardrum, but it didn't, so I was lucky. It was hard to get a report unless they sent a patrol or a helicopter or something out. Occasionally we got reports that they'd been out and looked at the grid references, and if we were firing in a contact, though, it was the forward observer's job to tell us the effectiveness of what we were doing. So in those occasions we did. It was a bit hard for them, though, because in any sort of close country, what they've done is, contacts was a bit different, but a standard mission, if they were just adjusting a defensive fire task for future use, the first round had to be put 1 kilometre further away than they wanted it. and that was to take account of map reading issues with the observers and the infantry moving through the jungle. Sure, they were navigating by compass bearing and pacing, but just to make sure, instead of having that first round land 200 or 300 metres away, they put it a kilometre away. And then the forward observer would listen to it land and then say, okay, it's on the right bearing. And then he'd give a drop correction and then we'd bring it back, say, 400 metres, listen to another one land, and then he'd bring it back again to where he wanted it. So in those occasions, that sort of mission, the fact that the round is landed where they want it is the report you get. In a contact mission, they actually followed the same procedure, but they didn't need to put it a kilometre away. They took the risk. But it would still be that they had to put the round down and then adjust it fractionally by fire, so that the fire's landing on the ground and you can just move it slowly back in. The contacts we had, we were used to provide cut-off, what was called cut-off fire. So the contact would occur and you'd talk to the company commander or whoever, and he would say, there's the obvious line of retreat for the enemy, so I want you to put the fire down on that line of retreat. And so that's what we would do while they handled the close stuff. You had a bombardier assistant who was also an observer, and you had 3 signallers. And so normally the forward observer would travel with the company commander and the assistant would travel with one of the platoons. And so your job was to navigate, know where you were, and when the infantry got into trouble, your job was to bring down the fire where they wanted the fire, and to provide advice to them on issues such as, well, what is the line of fire between the guns and us? Because if they were facing the line of fire, if the shells were coming straight towards them, then the splinter pattern of the shell goes forward. So the danger distance was much greater. You couldn't bring the projectiles in as close as you could as if the line was going overhead. Overhead, the splinter pattern goes away from the infantry and you could gradually bring the shells back in. So there was that sort of advice to give. Here's the trees around us. What's the angle that the round is falling on? Is the tree going to set it off? If it does set it off, where are the splinters going to go? So you had to be alive to all those sorts of issues, and in fulfilling the request that was given to you by the infantry. The forward observers lived with the infantry companies, not with the battery. So they were up there. We called it affiliation. You were basically affiliated with a company, and the battery was affiliated with the battalion. It always worked with that battalion. So we were with 5 RAR on its second tour. So that the personalities got to know each other, got to know their strengths and weaknesses, got to trust each other, and in that sense were able to provide the best support they could. I actually saw my first computer in Vietnam, and it was in the American battery command post. And the thing that got me about it was they were using it, but they were also using their manual system, and they wouldn't fire just based on the computer. And the computer took longer to get the firing data than we took to produce it manually. But you knew that we were firing pretty simple missions, to be honest. But there were other missions that are quite complicated. When they want the guns, for example, spread out in a line, and you're going to fire smoke, which has a time fuse on it. So you've got to calculate the fuse length, you've got to calculate the displacement of each gun. So that can be quite time consuming, and you could see that if you could put that into a computer, it'd be fantastic. But they hadn't got to that point yet. But anyway, look, we didn't, as gun batteries, we didn't have a lot of interface with them, except if they were deployed in the same fire support base we were. But their fire was controlled by the artillery regiment's headquarters. So the headquarters artillerymen were giving them the orders about where they wanted them to fire. Some people spent their whole tours as forward observers, but the people on the gun line, we all changed around during the tour, and I think that was to relieve pressure and stress. Because I started off as a section commander. I went and then was allocated to become a forward observer. I was there for 6 weeks. And then I was sent actually into the artillery headquarters, into what they called arty-tac, which was controlling the fire of the artillery in the province. And then I went back to the battery as the gun position officer in the end. And I think that was just done to stop people getting, stale. And the FOs, they were the ones facing the physical danger. So they came back, a couple of those came back to the gun line as section commanders and duty officers. Every time the battalion went on operations, we went out on a fire support base. The only exception was when we first arrived and the battalion was operating in the task force base's area of operations and we didn't need to go out. But every other battalion operation we went out, and as the tour went on, as the threat in the province declined, quite often they would take 3 guns and send them off to its own little fire support base. So, and maybe with an APC troop or something like that. The fire support base is just it's like a task force battalion base, basically, in miniature. The battalion headquarters is there. Probably one of the platoons is there as protection. The mortar platoon was probably there. The gun battery was there. And so each of them had a slice of the perimeter, just a big circle. And each of them had a slice of the perimeter to look after. By the time you were there a few days, by the time they flew in little bulldozers and all sorts of things, and so by the time the bulldozers pushed up all the gun bunds and a bund around the exterior of this thing and you put out wire, it didn't take long for the whole thing to be cleared, yeah. We all got R&R, and after about 6 months, I think that was the minimum time, then you got a week's R&R, and occasionally he got a couple of days R&C, which is rest and convalescence. So he took off down to the logistic base at Vung Tau. It was called Vungers, yes, Vungers, and there was an Australian facility there with a swimming pool and had a surf beach, swimming pool. But most of the guys went into town and went into the bars and places like that in town. The complication was there was a couple of hotels in town you could actually stay in. So you didn't have to stay on the base. There's a hotel called the Grand, which I remember, which you could book a room in the Grand and so you could stay in town there. Certainly, in a sense of being a shared area, it probably was. I mean, the Viet Cong were everywhere that we weren't, basically. You know, even the local town of Baria nearby, or Hualong, the village just outside the base, there were Viet Cong or Viet Cong sympathisers in all those places. So they would have been in Vung Tau. But I think there seemed to be an unwritten rule that if you don't, within certain parameters, nothing would happen. But even so, I never felt particularly safe wandering around there at night. Why, I don't know, because several people did, but I just didn't feel safe. And I had a friend who was posted to the logistic base there, and when I went down there, we'd grab a Land Rover and we'd take off, but we never went outside the limits of Vung Tau. Everyone knew There was days to go was a constant thing, and because it's not well understood, but we actually had those national servicemen I spoke about before. They went home in June. This is halfway through our tour. And then there's another tranche went home in September, October, and another tranche went home in November. So the battery that went over was not the battery that went home. It was entirely different, except for sort of a cadre of personnel who stayed the whole way. So within the battery, there'd be guys who were going home soon. So they'd be up every morning saying, 10 and a wakey, and pointing at your fingers and saying, you've got 200 to go and I've only got 10 to go, sort of business. So there was that sort of humour about it. But you didn't worry about it too much. Even when it got close, even you knew you were going out on your last operation, you were pleased in a sense, because a year's a long time to be away, and I've never thought that the danger we were in was all that great, but talking to some of the chaps who are in the battery, for them it was different. So you can see the stress that was building up in people throughout the year, and then the relief as they saw that plane came and you got on it and you were on your way home. If I was an infantryman out in the jungle looking for trouble, or had trouble looking for me, then I'd feel it. As a gunner on a fire support base, even though in our last month we had one of those section fire support bases, we were out in the middle of nowhere by ourselves. Even though we had one of those, I didn't feel that sort of trepidation. During our time, I think the province, the threat level in the province went down, and so they took a few more risks that they wouldn't have taken previously. And our last operation was up in the northwest of the province, and we went into a main fire support base, and then the companies started to operate further and further away. So I took a section of guns up into a cleared area just near the Vung Tau mountains, and there was only us and 2 or 3 APCs, and we built ourselves a little fire support base, and we knew that we were on a VC transit route or supply route. We knew we were on that, and so we were within range of the other 3 guns. So we wired ourselves up and had our machine guns and all that sort of stuff, and we had defensive fire tasks around, adjusted by the other guns. So, but that was the fire support base. Couple of incidents. We were there one night, just finished firing some H&Is, and all of a sudden there was a scream which I really cannot describe. And we wondered what had happened. We doused the lights and stood to, and it turned out that one of the gunners was having a nightmare. But everyone's blood pressure went up that night, and there were reports of people moving around the base. The APCs had some night vision gear, and one night they came and said, there's some people out there. So we pushed one of our guns up against the outer bund and loaded it up with a round called Splintex, which is like a great big shotgun cartridge. And I sent one of the command post crew around to wake up the other detachments and get them to stand to without making a noise. But they didn't get to the last gun before we fired the particular gun. So the last gun's rude awakening was us letting go this Splintex and the APCs letting go with the machine guns. And so the sergeant in charge of that gun was most annoyed that you don't poke lieutenants in the chest, but he came poking lieutenants in the chest. Yeah, we came back on a return, 707 came up with a group of people, and we got on it and went home. There was some discussion where we would land. The battery had come out of Brisbane and they wanted to land in Brisbane, but the powers that be said, no, you're going to land in Sydney. So we landed in Sydney, which is fine for me because my fiancée lived in Canberra, and we were all going straight on leave. We weren't reporting for duty or anything. So in that sense, we had no welcome home parade, and indeed the national servicemen who left during the year, they had nothing either. And for me it wasn't so bad because I was in the army and we went on leave and I got married and I went back to the School of Artillery and did another course, and then life went on. And I didn't actually realise until they had the welcome home parade in 1987, and I was marching along with some of the gunners, and one fellow from West Australia was crying the whole time. And I asked him about that, and he said, when I came home, one of these little national service groups, we just got off the plane and we were sent home. So he was sent home to a wheat farm in West Australia. And no one there knew what he had done. There was no one there he could talk to. And so all this was bottled up inside him until he got to 1987, and then out it came. And we didn't realise the importance of, I think, recognising what these people had been through. It was the national servicemen, I think, who came home, and they may have done, some of the blokes in the battery did another 6 months and then were discharged. But they were the ones, I think, who went out into the community with no anchor. So they're the ones who probably suffered the most. I stayed on in the army. When I came back from Vietnam, I was sent to the UK to train as a gunnery instructor. So I then had some subsequent postings to the School of Artillery, including being the commanding officer. And then I finished my career as the Chief of Personnel for the Army in 1997. And when I left that, I was appointed to the Repatriation Commission here in Veterans Affairs. When I went to the department, it was just after a significant anniversary. So in 95 would have been 50 years, wouldn't it, of the end of the Second World War. And there'd been a big Australia Remembers program, which actually kicked off commemorations within the Department of Veterans Affairs. When I arrived, the commemorations staff was about 6. In my time, it grew to be a whole branch. And that was good. So Anzac Day, I've always commemorated Anzac Day, not so much Remembrance Day. And I don't know why that is really. I think only in the sense that I think for Australia, Anzac Day trumps Remembrance Day. And so I haven't always marched, but most years I've marched, and most years I still do. I think it does get stronger as you get older. As a result of that Welcome Home March, for example, the battery that I went to Vietnam with decided to form an association of veterans, and it did, and that's been running now for 30 years or so. But no one was interested in doing that immediately upon discharge or while serving. It was only later on in life that they wanted to renew that comradeship. And so they've done that. And the difficulty now is that everyone's getting so old and everyone's spread around Australia. How do you maintain that comradeship? But Anzac Day has been a key part of that. The only thing that struck me when I was working in Veterans Affairs and talking to people is people talk about Vietnam veterans. But there is actually no such thing as there are Vietnam veterans, obviously. But I think what I want to say is every one of them's different. I'm a gunner officer, lieutenant. He's an infantry section commander. He's a transport driver. He's an ordnance queue store man. Everyone's experience is different, and sometimes we lump it all together, and it's not right. Everyone's got a story to tell, and that was the other thing that came out of my experience in Veterans Affairs, is getting people to tell their story. I was lucky enough to go back with veterans of the Second World War, even the First World War, to their battlefields. And you talk to them and they tell you stories, and you say to them, have you ever told your family this? Oh, no. Why not? It's not my job to burden them with what happened to me. Or they wouldn't, oh, it's not interesting. I said, but it is interesting. It's interesting to the family, even if it's not interested, even if the War Memorial doesn't see it as one of their prime stories. And the other point my wife often makes is that unless individuals tell their story, that very common level of history will disappear. And that very common level of history is of interest. She says, what did the people who built the pyramids eat for lunch? Nobody knows because nobody's written it down.